All right, we would like to welcome everybody to City Council General Government Meeting. We're going to start with roll call, please.
Councilmember Cochran, absent. Councilmember Gonzalez.
Here.
Councilmember Hamrick.
Here.
Councilmember Jaquez, absent. Councilmember Meisner.
Here.
Councilmember Turner.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Smith.
Here.
Mayor Troutman.
Here.
All right, well, I think it's no surprise with all of the rain we've been getting. I was reading in the paper that we are 99% out of drought in Colorado, so that's pretty exciting. I'm glad to hear that, and I hope that everybody's doing well today, and want to express appreciation to those who came to our meeting today in the audience, and would like to invite you, if you have any comments you'd like to make, there are pieces of paper on that side table you're welcome to fill out and turn it into our city clerk, Cindy, right here on the corner. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn the time over to Ryan Stevens and Dina Svutlik for our presentation.
Thank you. So the discussion today is about riverfront development between First Street and Third Street. The development of the north side of the river is going to require some types of infrastructure improvements in order to develop these riverfront sites. So what has been identified would be putting in Water Street from First to Third Streets. That's being estimated at about a $500,000 cost for curb gutter, stormwater. Other infrastructure that would need to be added would be water main along Water Street, which is $100,000 estimated. Sanitary sewer, so the sewer from the First Street line to the Skyline Steel site, estimated between $350,000 and $500,000. And then again, sanitary sewer from the Skyline Steel site over to the 200 Water Street, the ice plant, about the same distance, $350,000 to $500,000 to make that investment. We do have potential source for partial funding for this project, and that would be from the capital reserve in the general fund for capital infrastructure. There's $1,283,000 approximately in that account. Some of that money, though, should be reserved. That is, the fund that we use for property acquisition. So, looking at future acquisition targets, you want to keep that in mind, that we can't tap that out for full infrastructure. As far as the next steps go for this project, we are still in discussions with Acorn Petroleum about potential acquisition of that site. I actually have a meeting with them tomorrow and the Office of Oil and Public Safety at the state level. The Skyline Steel site will need to be platted based on the lot size, future Riverwalk, and anything from the planning and zoning standpoint to make sure that those sites are ready to be sold and built upon. Number 3, complete riverfront zoning language. We're working on setting up a work session to go through that language on August 7th, which is a general government meeting. Number 4, plan and design the utility infrastructure, the Riverwalk, Water Street extension, all of those types of things. There might be some potential sources of funding, potentially through the Brownfield Assessment Grant that we're currently in a coalition with, and we're going to be working on putting a nomination forward for this site to go through that process. And then, once those things are done, we need to decide on a development approach, and that's could be going out and doing an RFP and seeing if we can find a developer that wants to put in the infrastructure. Or, the other option would be act as horizontal developer and put in the infrastructure and then go out for an RFP with a shovel-ready site. This time, Dina, do you have anything else that you might want to add to this discussion?
Sure, Ryan, thanks. So I think it's important to note that some of the, I don't think all of the costs are in here. And some of those costs will really be determined on some of the more detailed design work that I think is still needed. So, for example, regarding the street, so the cost for the street right now is estimated at about $500,000. That's simply a 24-foot roadway. It does not include a sidewalk, or any parking, if we would want to accommodate any parking in that location. So ideally, staff can do a little bit more rolling up the sleeves and have a work session and really dive into a little bit more detail in terms of what can really fit within the distance between the railroad right-of-way and the river edge. I think at an absolute minimum, we would want a sidewalk on the Water Street side of things. So that needs to be accommodated. I would like to also, there's examples of, in other communities where folks have worked with the railroad right-of-way, in this case it's UP, and actually gained easement within their right-of-way. So right now there's a substantial, in my mind, there's room between the edge of the tracks and the existing property lines to potentially get an easement from them for parking, because every little bit of incremental parking that we can get in would be fantastic in this area. There's examples of in Central Platte Valley in Denver, there are literally condo buildings 20 feet away from the UP line. So yes, these are conversations that have to be had, and they might take quite a while, but I think they're worth having to really increase the amount of parking that we can get in that area. So that's outside of necessarily a cost. It's initial conversations that need to be had. Another item that's not really estimated at this time is with the Water Street extension that needs to connect over to First Street, depending on where that alignment comes in. If it aligns where the connection currently exists to the Black Hills site on the west side of First Street, that most likely will include piping the ditch in that section. So that's another incremental cost. So the other component of this is we don't have any costs yet for the Riverwalk itself. So there's still, I think, a little bit more work to be done in terms of some of the design work, particularly the closer we get to First Street in terms of making sure that we're accommodating a future Riverwalk that potentially goes under First Street as well as connects up to First Street from a pedestrian and bicycle standpoint. And so all of that would be within some next stage design work that would be done. And as mentioned, the very first step of that is starting with an actual survey and getting more detailed topographic information, in particular for the Skyline Steel site, and that is has just been put underway with Adam. And so the earliest that might come in, we should have that by July, maybe sooner, but I'm saying July to be a little bit more conservative. So those are just some of the additional considerations that I think need to be taken into account.
Did you say that there is a survey underway?
I think Adam just conveyed that information to the...
Yeah, he just ordered it.
Yep.
Okay. I remember years ago when it was talked about, there was some dispute over whether there's a spur in there, railroad spur, who owns what, where, and when, and will that be looked at?
Right, so there is a spur. Let's see if I can get this to...
I mean, I'm assuming it's not in the city's ownership, but...
No, well, right now it's showing that it's in UP's right-of-way. So
Okay.
this is the spur, Mayor, that you're speaking of.
Yeah.
Based on at least the county assessor information, it appears that spur is within the UP's right-of-way, but that's part of the survey work to just absolutely make sure where that property line sits on that edge.
And discussions with the Route Railroad, I don't know if they claim ownership of it, but they do use the spur.
So there's no mood to just take the track out and let them contact us? Just joking, just joking. Beg for forgiveness.
I think it works like that.
Doesn't it? Okay, never mind. Never mind. What's the blue line?
That is the floodplain line, and then
Okay.
this is the floodway line.
Okay, so everything essentially to the north of that the dark blue line is not in the floodplain.
Right, so this section of Veterans Park is not within the floodplain.
Okay. Any idea how high a building would have to be to, or is it impossible to get it out of the floodplain? Or what?
Well, yes, they could be raised.
Okay.
In terms of the floodplain. That's part of what we'll be taking a closer look at
Okay.
in terms of
Okay.
creation of the zone district language to make sure that accommodating the existing floodway, right?
Right.
So something else to consider is that through the design of the Riverwalk in this area, particularly as you get closer to First Street, so again, if in the future we want a Riverwalk connection under First Street and potentially connecting further to the west, as well as a connection coming up to First Street, that most likely involves sort of digging out, right, and digging out or scooping out land, which in the future then could adjust that floodway line. And that's why it would be nice to do some initial design work on that to get a better sense of what that might mean for future floodway mapping, and also in terms of then identifying a definitive parcel to go out for RFP in the future. We don't know where those lines are right now.
And sewer, I read this earlier, is a big expense. Is there any other alternative? Not being an engineer, is there an alternative? I mean, we're talking about a huge pipe. Can North Canyon, they use an injection system? You're not going to have that much there. Wouldn't that be cheaper?
We'd have to ask the city engineer on
Okay.
that one. I think, yeah, we certainly open to options, but yeah, I think we'd have to do more due diligence on that.
And there's no alternative going east? It always does it have to go west?
The
Is that where it's going?
The
yes.
existing line this is very general, but generally goes in that direction.
Yeah, so if you go a little bit further down, I think just to the left of your cursor, Dina, right in that area is where they would more than likely tap in. And I think the issue with that one is that it's a very deep line. So there's a lot of excavation
yeah.
and site work that has to be done.
So there's just no possibility you could go east?
To the east, I think the train is interested into connecting, potentially connecting into the line that we're developing. So there really isn't anything east.
They're not on sewer? The train station is on sewer?
I think they have a
They have a
small
lift.
pump. Oh, yeah, a lift. a
Lift
pump.
station, if I can
Oh,
get over
okay.
this way.
Yeah.
They have a lift station on this site.
Okay,
But doesn't quite meet the capacity if they're,
yeah.
that they would like.
It seems like a huge expense. Okay.
We have a question from Councilman Meisner.
Sorry, I didn't.
Just kind of refresh me in terms of where the potential river, Water, is that the name of the street?
Water Street?
Just kind of show me where that would run with your cursor.
Sure. So right now, this is existing city right-of-way here. So generally, it would be an extension of that, kind of abutting up to the UP right-of-way, coming through the site on the north side of these parcels and the south side of the railroad right-of-way, continuing through and connecting over to First Street. And the idea is to try to maximize the development parcel area between that future Water Street and the future Riverwalk in that area.
Right. Makes sense.
And it looks like that would require the requirement of the petroleum property,
Acorn,
Acorn.
correct.
What if we did not acquire that property? Could we still put Water Street in?
You could. So then Water Street would dip down. I'm not sure what the elevations are connecting with First Street here, but that does then sort of split this area into two smaller parcels.
Okay, we have a question from Councilman Hamrick.
Sure, thank you. So, well, several questions. Maybe, it might be nice to go over property ownership because those are the white lines on there, is that right, a little bit? But before you do that, is it an either-or proposition for an RFP? Could we not just put out an RFP and say, assume that, ask for kind of a two-part response, if they were so inclined, with utilities, without utilities? And then thirdly, do we have a complete list of everything that needs to be done that covers everything, like power? Would we be responsible for putting in power and
Right, so as Brian mentioned in the presentation, so that number 5, deciding on an approach to a development proposal and potentially going out to an RFP, won't happen until some of these other steps are done. Definitively, we need a existing survey to start with. We need a future survey, a future parcel boundary, to know what that parcel is that we're going out to RFP for. In terms of what the width is for that future dedication of Water Street, what the width is for the future dedication of a river walk, particularly, obviously, in this site, which is the Skyline Steel site. So there's a lot of things to have discussions around before an RFP is in consideration, in my opinion.
okay, and property ownership lines, maybe?
So the existing,
Yeah, so
Ownership?
So that's Skyline Steel there.
right, so
Correct.
this is Skyline, this is the Acorn. So when we refer to Acorn, obviously to the west of First Street is Black Hills property. As we go further east, everybody knows this, it's either 200 Water or the ice plant site. And then as we move further to the east is the city lands in terms of the parking lot. So the city owns the parking lot, this particular area, as well as the area adjacent to the river itself.
And that showed, back towards Black Hills, that shows their property split in half? Is that correct?
I'm sorry, which parcel?
Black Hills?
That's a floodway.
It's,
No, I'm sorry. So right there where the road comes in, there's a white line, kind of
The
just
triangle,
below your
Dina.
cursor.
yeah, this.
Right there.
You mean this, right. So again, this is information pulled from the county assessor site. That's additional survey work that would be needed to really identify where property boundaries are, where the UP right-of-way is. So I'm presuming this is UP right-of-way boundary. But for instance, on the north side of the tracks here and west of First Street, there, as far as we understand, there is a separate parcel here. So there's a line missing in this location.
Okay, and that parcel would be Black Hills, is that correct?
The No,
The northern one?
So this parcel in the corner here is actually owned by the train folks.
Route Railroad.
Thank you.
Yep.
And weren't we looking to see if there was a potential lease for parking there?
There's some potential for partnership on that site.
Right.
Dolly, you have some questions?
Yeah, my button's not working.
It's working on mine.
Oh, it is? Oh. So if we scale back over,
To the east?
that's good.
Okay.
All that is owned by the city, and there's an easement. How come there's no easement in front of Skyline Steel, or will we?
That's what we need to create.
Okay.
So that's part of what the next step efforts in terms of design of the Riverwalk in that area. If we definitively know that in the future we'd like to have a Riverwalk that splits and goes under First Street as well as connects up to First Street, we need to understand from a design standpoint and a banking standpoint what the depth of that needs to be from the edge of water or edge of sort of low water to future top of bank, speaking loosely, including that future river walk, so we can draw that future line. That line doesn't exist. That line needs to exist.
Okay, I have a few questions. For your estimates for the street and the sewer and the water line, how accurate would you say those estimates are? Are those numbers that we would need to do a little bit more research on to have more realistic?
Those numbers were done by the engineering department, and they provided a cost per linear foot.
So you say those are pretty rudimentary costs, or do you think,
I
or how conservative are they?
would say they're probably fairly conservative. But yeah, I think, once we get into the design, we'll be able to refine those numbers and have a better idea of what the actual cost will be.
And for Water Street, going across the north side of the ice plant property, is there room for a street to go through there, or would that require more partnership?
That would require a partnership, absolutely. The parcel is about 122 feet deep presently, from what I looked up online. So there's plenty of room in terms of a future roadway and still retaining a viable development parcel.
So what kind of partnership do you see needing to be created? John, Paul?
I think we'd have to sit down and talk with the property owner and work out an arrangement.
I guess the question is that a conversation you're interested in having?
I was gonna, when we tell Dina was done to talk, do you wanna?
Just, go ahead and come up and tell us what we need to hear. You're kind of a key player in this future.
So just to go over a few of what Dina's had to say, I pretty much completely agree with the position she's coming from. The little bit, we've been working on this project for, over 3 years or longer, so we've had lots of engineers involved and lots of architects involved and done a lot of this legwork that you are talking about. Just to go through some of so I don't get all off track, maybe a couple of things we're missing is one of the important factors of developing that area is what's going to happen and when's it going to happen, and the phasing of the construction of the river. We completed the river work from the last project up to the edge of Skyline's property. And then from Skyline to First didn't get completed. So any developer is going to want to know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And they can't go in there and do any sort of development work on that if it's going to need to be all tore up to fix the river. So I think that certainly needs to be on the agenda for phasing. Reference to the road, the proposed Water Street, it's always been the intent to make that a one-lane road, at most an extremely narrow 2-lane road. You're taking the most valuable property, maybe the most valuable property in Canyon City, and turning it into a road that's any wider than it absolutely has to be is not a great idea. Access, even one-way access out of those businesses would be the goal. In an emergency situation, you could certainly get fire trucks and stuff up on it. I think the focus has always been there's only one access to the train depot now. And when that train crosses those tracks, there's absolutely no emergency access down there, none. So it's always been a focus to create at least a one lane in there. I don't know that 24 feet would be the right measurement. I think you might look at that and say, hey, all we need is 14 feet, or, the sidewalk certainly has always been a point. I think the railroad right-of-way is a high priority. Back in the day, Mr. Havens was actively involved in trying to get that right-of-way purchased, or at least a lease put on it. I don't know if that information has got lost or what has happened to it, but he was highly involved in that and thought he was just about to get there. So I think it's pretty important that somebody picks that ball back up and says, hey, yeah, that right-of-way could be I mean, you could put Water Street on that right away. I don't know that they're going to want a building on it, but I can't imagine why they wouldn't want, a roadway on it. But the other thing that's not talked about is, that's probably a pretty high priority if you have a developer spending money, is the south side of the river. We got a pretty ugly maintenance building that's owned by somebody. And I think that needs to be on the list of priorities, is to get that very unappealing site changed into something different that would be more
Yeah,
appealing to a developer.
I think that is our ultimate goal too on our plans. It's just either
Just not
need-
on the list,
We
yeah.
just need some folks to sell their homes or find a new place for that site
Right,
too. Yeah.
right. The existing parking lot is, was on the agenda at one time, that certainly needed redesign. There's quite a bit of wasted area in there, and I think the parking down there is a huge issue. Along with that brings up, assess the value of Veterans Park. It's completely a emotional conversation when you talk about a park, but that park is very unuseful the way it is. It has no parking. It's basically a place for homeless people to hang out right now. But, there's been conversations of, hey, how valuable is that park where it is compared to that parking lot? Here we are using some of the most valuable ground in Canyon City for a parking lot, when if you could imagine flipping it, what you would have. But not to mention Joe Q Public or the traveling, the guy cruising down Highway 50 doesn't know there's a parking lot down there. So they drive right by it. And even if they see the park, they can't get into the park. So I think there needs to be we need to get past the emotional conversation and do some real thinking about the value of Veterans Park right there. But the floodway line is, when you're talking about this Skyline property, I think it's really important for council to understand what that floodway line does to that property. And Dina was correct in saying that the river work could help that. I had conversations with people with city staff prior to that river work, asking for them to pay attention to that when we done that section. Every section of riverbank that you touch has a big impact on that floodway line. And we just got through doing X amount of feet and didn't do one single thing to help that line. So opportunity completely missed. You certainly wouldn't want to do that with the next river project. But with that line, it was my understanding, and I think Adam or some engineer, water engineer, somebody that clearly understands the flood issues, could speak to the bottleneck downstream that's causing that line to interfere with that property. But the floodplain line versus the floodway line is night and day. You cannot do anything in that floodway line. So if you put an RFP out and we don't address what we're going to do with that line, it's not going to go nowhere. There are engineering methods that you can engineer solutions beyond just the line drawn in the sand, so to speak. It can create some engineering analysis and turn in a flood, what they call a no-rise letter, and you can get variances to that. I can't speak to the clear facts of how that all works, but if you're going to put an RFP out to try to develop that ground when a pretty sizable amount of the ground is covered with, encompasses floodway, that's 100% undevelopable unless there's an engineered method around it or there's more thought put into what we do to the river. Keeping in mind, we already made a huge mistake when we fixed the river where we did and we didn't do anything about it. It's a volume thing. And my understanding was What's causing that bottleneck and causing that to move out is the bridge abutment on 4th Street. And there was conversation of actually moving that bridge abutment and expanding that river channel right there. That was the sort of the Achilles heel to all of that floodplain line. But I think it's pretty important for council to understand what we're doing with that before we enter into an RFP. The other thing that we researched quite a bit was the sewer line. It's really not per se a choice of the developer. It's the sanitation district tells you what you're going to do. And the manhole that's at the bridge at, would that be 1st Street, is where they make you tie in. That's where they referred us to that we would have to tie in. So we've done some engineering on that. And it's really, really deep, which is really good. And so it would, it would service that whole area. And currently, there's nothing down there. To my knowledge, the train was pumping theirs into a city-owned lift station, I think. Mm-hmm. Some sort of agreement through the years. But I think they're highly interested in trying to make that happen as well. The cost estimates that we had put on that sewer line was $100,000 from a contractor who does that. Now, I don't know what all the city had engineered in their stuff.
Those were cost estimates that we received from the sanitation district.
Okay. So, but it sounded like it was $350,000 to $500,000 for halfway, and then another $350 to $500 for the other halfway.
Correct.
I'll sign that contract today.
So your engineer, your estimate
go
was
ahead and
from
write that
First
up.
Street to Ice Plant? Your estimate was from First Street to Ice Plant?
We were going to First Street to the east edge of our property.
Okay.
But,
So it sounds like we might need to get some
you know,
more
I think
estimates.
I think you could you could probably put an RFP out really, really simply and get a price from people who specialize in that at a pretty minimal expense to the city, so that we know whether we're talking about a $200,000 problem or a $1 million problem.
Sure.
Other than that, I don't know that, we didn't talk about it, it's not on the list, but the Veterans Park conversation I talked about, but along with that was the 20, 30, 40 trees in between Veterans Park and this area. You can't see this area. You have no idea this area is down here because all those trees have blocked it. And currently those trees are serving as shelter for the homeless. So I don't know. I was told that originally they were put in there for a safety barrier so that you can't walk across the tracks. I don't know, but I think that certainly needs to be on your list of, I don't know that you're going to get anybody to sign on to a big RFP if they can't even see what's going on down there. So, other than that, is to your original question of are we interested? Yeah, we're absolutely interested. We've been in conversation with engineers and architects for years trying to make this project happen. And as you can see, there's a handful of roadblocks holding things up. But I commend the city for taking the step to buy Skyline. I think that was very, very forward-thinking, and I know that the city will probably take a little grief from it from some people, but I think it was the right thing to do to push forward on what we need to do.
All right, thank you, John Paul. We do have some questions from Mayor.
A couple things. Did you ever get a survey of your property, a stake survey?
Oh, yeah. Three times, I think. Last time we sent it to, we just had it recorded.
So there are stakes there?
Oh, yeah.
So
they pull them. They have a habit of pulling them, but they're in there right now.
Okay.
There's some marks on there's a stake next to the tracks, and there's some flags on the fence where the stakes are.
Has your company ever had contact with Union Pacific about that?
With the who?
The railroads.
We didn't, I was working with John Havens, and he had some connections. And unfortunately, I don't have any knowledge of how far we got on. He was pretty confident that he was going to make that happen.
I knew there was discussion about the spur, and I think that's what they were going with it, that it was that. I have dealt with UP and other things, and they're kind of protective of their spurs, as cowboys are. But anyway.
I think this site is unique because it's a private line.
Yes.
And I think there's a separation between, are we going to remove the spur, which we're definitely going to remove the spur that they're not using. I think the actual train, the tourist train has control of that spur. That's not a through line. And they have control of that spur. But I think we're not asking to own it, we're just asking to occupy the space.
Yeah. And to your knowledge, do you know if you filled, grade that up, could that remove some of the?
It will fix the floodplain line, 3.5 feet. It's roughly 3.5 feet.
Okay.
You got to raise it. That will get you out of the floodplain.
Plain.
We can build in the floodplain anyway.
But
You can do things in the floodplain. The floodway is a completely different set
Sure.
of problems.
you can't get yourself out.
But you can injure, there is ways, it's as simple as a no-rise letter. You have to prove what you're doing is not going to cause a rise in the river.
Oh.
But it's more difficult in the floodway. Like I say, the work to the river bank, it's as simple as if you take volume out of that bank, it pulls that line in. Every cubic yard of material that you make room for water moves the line closer to the river.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Councilman Meisner?
Thank you, sir, for showing. Maybe between you and Dean, I don't know, but the dark blue line designates the floodway.
Plain. That light blue one's floodway.
So just for everybody, so this lighter line with the black dashes in is the floodway, so the more onerous line.
Okay.
And the floodplain is this blue line. So this area of the Skyline Steel site is within the floodway, and this portion of the site is within the floodplain.
Would you zoom that out
Presently.
a little bit? Would you zoom that out a little bit, please, Dina, so we could see First and Fourth Streets? Yeah, thank you.
Is that too much?
So you can do horizontal building on floodway. I mean, it's not ideal to have a parking in that area right next to the river, but there are some horizontal things that can be done.
Right, so non-occupied space. Right, and so I wasn't asked to necessarily prepare anything specific for today. Here for the conversation, brought this image to have for conversation, but just reiterates this is a really important area in the community, and we want to make sure that we're doing it right. And so I think there is a lot of planning and design and strategic thinking that still needs to be had in terms of some of those processes and timelines, before we can say go to an RFP, for instance.
Mm-hmm. I do have a comment for John Paul, for you. When you talked about the emotional attachment to Veterans Park, I also just want to point out for your future conversations that there's also a municipal code, maybe not emotion, but just conflict also with parks in general, and that is that the city cannot create a park or even obtain land for a park or open space without taking it to the voters for approval. So that makes it extremely difficult to create parks in Canyon City. I mean, almost next to impossible to create parks for Canyon City. And so from a practical view, just to tear down a park, it would be really hard to replace that. And so there's some municipal code conflicts with that too. It makes it a little bit more complicated.
And if I may, one of the other pieces of the puzzle is we know that this, the comment that we don't really want surface parking front and center necessarily at this section of the riverfront. And that's why it's really important to do more detailed design work, particularly from First to Fourth. And that needs to be taken into consideration with where in the future will reservoirs for parking be more on the fringe, so.
So and is that referring to the Black Hills property and potentially the railroad property, kitty corner to Gus's? Is that what you're referring to?
Right, well, the piece of land, kitty corner to Gus's, I think is pretty small. That would be more just shorter term temporary, potentially a western pull-off. I think the Black Hills site is the more logical place for the larger reservoir.
So are you just looking for guidance on where we want to go for the future?
That is correct. I'd like to have an idea of where you want us to go and where you want us to put our resources.
Okay, I think we have a question from Jim Meisner first.
Well, it's not a question. I thought we were moving forward, so I was going to give you a comment. I mean, my thought process is, obviously, the link with the easement and the railroad is critical. And I would like to see some effort put forth in that.
Right.
And second, considering all the other things that are going on in the community, I suggest we minimize the impact on that, those monies that are being held for acquisition purposes.
You're saying that you want to preserve as much as that capital asset acquisition money?
Well,
Not spend it?
$1.2 million isn't a whole lot of money relative to that. I mean, if we're going to spur any other issues that are going on in the city or in the county, and to assist with some of that and do some acquisition, it's not a whole lot of money to do something with.
Like attaining property for a community recreation center, that type of thing?
Whatever it is that we're going to do that's going to enhance the community, and there's got to be other ways that we find to do some of these development things. I mean, it's not something that's going to happen in the next 6 months, but we can continue to plan for development of this, reserve monies. Cut that $500,000 that we're potentially going to lose from Black Hills, and if we don't lose it, put it in that fund. I mean, we've got to make those difficult decisions relative to that money, and we know we got to make that cut before it happens. Cut that money and put it in that fund and start building. I mean, building that fund up.
So, but before even talking about construction, is there a desire to move forward with design? Because there's some monies that will be needed for design, and we can definitely consider grant funding and things like that, but there may be some out-of-pocket expenses for the design portion of the work that still needs to be done.
I think before we move too far, we need to get the railroad thing squared away. I mean, that impacts everything. We need to find out where we stand with a firm agreement relative to the railroad, because if we can't wrap that up.
You mean in terms of a potential easement?
Yeah, I mean, if we
Right.
can't wrap that up, it changes the whole ballgame in terms of where everything's going to lay out. I mean, that's my perception. John or somebody else may have a different one, but if
So I
you
would
can't
say-
wrap up what you're going to do with the railroad and the street,
I would say
problem.
some of those could move forward in parallel a little bit, so we can reach out to UP and start having those conversations. We can also start putting sort of a cost estimate together for the design work. I don't even think that's been done yet. So getting a better sense of what it would cost for the design work for both Water Street and for the riverfront improvements. So you have that cost to consider, I would say would be a next step. And then going back to the easement conversation and John Paul's comment. So initially I was thinking, yeah, it'd be great. Let's see if we could potentially move that road into the railroad right-of-way. And thinking about that a little bit further, it probably makes sense to retain the road outside of the right-of-way, because even if it's a long-term lease agreement, an easement, you probably don't want the roadway itself necessarily in their right-of-way, because that's where the sewer and water lines need to go as well, so that might complicate things more than is necessary. But perhaps that's better served to be some parking areas to, again, get some more of that acute acute short-distance parking.
Okay, Dolly, you had pressed your button.
I just kind of wanted to kick back that idea of Veterans Park. I think there's some merit to it.
Of the what?
Veterans Park,
Oh,
I know you had said it's pretty difficult to convert a park. But I think that John Paul brought up a very good point. People don't know that that's down there. It's hidden, and if we're going to put a bunch of money and development and time and effort into that portion of the river, it needs to be visible, along with that land down there being so valuable. Is there a way we can explore some ways to maybe?
So from a parking standpoint, I think absolutely there could be some studies done in terms of modifications to not necessarily, I would say destroy, maybe isn't the right word, but destroy the feeling and sense of place of Veterans Park, but incrementally add additional parking in. I think that's a fairly easy exercise that can be
Or
completed.
even a portion of it. It's very
Well, a
valuable.
lot of communities fight tooth and nail to protect and create green space in their communities. That's incredibly valuable to a community to have.
Sure.
That. I'd hate to see that
Don't,
taken away.
right, I'm not
Yeah.
saying wholesale make it a parking lot. I'm just saying
Yeah.
incremental studies. Let's look at, hey, could we maybe subtly double the amount of parking in Veterans Park? Those are fairly easy studies that we can do.
Yeah.
And I can support that.
The other thing to consider, another piece of this puzzle and why all of these efforts are so interrelated, is we've just kicked off the US 50, the access control plan for this section of the community, and there may be some recommendations on that in terms of access and the pedestrian crossings getting across RGB. So we would want to take those into consideration. And I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I'm going to just use this as an example. One example is there's been some discussions about potentially closing the intersection of 3rd Street to vehicular traffic, moving the signal to First, which then would reiterate even more so the importance of Water Street getting installed. And that would allow that signal to occur at First Street, so you have that pause for folks coming at least from the west into town or back into town to make a decision to turn left to go to Main Street or right to go to the riverfront, and in combination with design and signage and wayfinding, that would provide better direction. So there's all of these things need to be taken into account.
Also,
Right.
no, sorry.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Also, from a financing standpoint, there are tools out there that we don't currently use, one of which is tax increment financing, which could help put in some of the infrastructure for this development. And it's an economic development tool that is used in many communities, and for the future of this river corridor, I think it's something that we should look at very hard at.
And I think that was one of my recommendations too, is we're looking forward. I can support, doing design work and more detailed studies on the actual costs and what it takes. Because I think to become more lucrative for a developer to come in, we need to have that work done, and we need to make sure that we have our easements and and protect our river walk and all of that. But I also want to explore other creative ways that we can be more appealing to developers without totally destroying our capital improvement fund too, whether it was, first 10 years of property taxes are waived and then work your way up to the front, or tax increment, all those there's lots of tools that we can use to help.
Yeah, and I think, tax increment financing, either through an urban renewal or some other type of authority, opens up the door for those property taxes to be put against the infrastructure improvements for future development along the river.
Mayor?
Since we can't do anything to cause any controversy around here, I would,
we can.
we can, look, if.
We never do that.
If it were I, I'm sorry, if it were I, and as a private developer, I'd say, let's look at it as if, leave the ice house, because that's not, we don't own that. We have the parking lot, we got Veterans Park, we got Skyline Steel. Let's look like an open slate, and let's take a look at it. a portion of Veterans Park, just a portion. If you look from the restroom east and west, you can take a big chunk out of that to make it parking. But let's turn Dina loose. I mean, say let's an open slate. Just go for it. I mean, really. Well, we have a year anyway. We have to wait before they get out. Why not?
We can explore different levels of impact to Veterans Park. We can put it that way. There's other considerations of, I mean, again, from a parking infrastructure standpoint, and this is going to get tied to the zoning conversation. If we are, so for example, on Main Street, we have 0 parking requirements, off-street parking requirements. Depending on what level we want to minimize or have potentially no requirement for parking in the riverfront zone districts, that also makes it that much more important to have a bigger conversation about where those off-site parking reservoirs are going to be for folks.
Yeah, I mean, we got the whole area. We got the Black Hills, which I think we'll eventually get. We'll have property down in front of the train station. We got a whole set of dynamics there that I just look at. Let's dream a little bit. Really. I think.
Okay, Jim Meisner.
Well, I think what goes kind of along with that is if you go back years to the initial conversations about Centennial and the amount of money that we were going to invest in Centennial, there's always been the off conversation that as Centennial gets developed, then what does that mean relative to veterans? But Veterans is a unique park in the sense that he gets utilized really differently. I don't know that you go by Veterans Park much and see kids playing in that park. And when we think about park in a community, it is designated as a park, but it is a very unique utilized park for things that I think the intention was to move a lot of that activity from veterans over to Centennial. At least I would hope so, considering what we spent on Centennial and for that pavilion and that whole arrangement. Because at that point in time, we realized that Centennial Park was not ideally set up for larger entertainment.
We also have Macon Plaza, that's the same kind of,
Yeah, but the parking's even worse there, and
It
it's a
is.
lot smaller. So there's lease for creativity, but please protect our green space is what I would say. And if we need to cut down some trees for visibility, that makes sense, but we need to maintain safety or whatever.
We can paint the asphalt green.
That's
Caitlin,
right.
you haven't
There you
put in
go.
your 2 cents
Don't.
yet.
We're going to install bike
Why
boxes?
restrict that conversation? It's just a conversation and, go ahead.
Well, okay, go ahead. Did you have a couple of things, John, and then I'd like to hear
Actually,
from Caitlin.
I think what Jim was talking about, I want to make sure that I may have helped mislead that. I completely agree with Dina. If you could purchase that right away, that would be one thing. I think that's probably a 1 in a million chance. If we could get 100% easement on it, if we could get a 100-year lease or some sort of lease on it to where we could use it, it's probably a pretty likelihood that we could turn that into parking lot, but you might not want to invest utilities and stuff in that right away. So I don't think it's a mistake to plan to extend waters along that boundary. And then if we could get something, in our business, we work with the railroad all the time. And probably a lot of people in here do. It's very, very difficult. It's very, very time consuming. I think it would not surprise me to be 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the road to get a decision out of them. I hate to see this property sit dormant for that period of time. So I would completely agree with Dina's analysis that let's figure out what we could do on that property line. To that point, I would certainly enter into conversations with the city on right of way to get waters through the property that we own. Gets us over to First Street. We had designed it when we were in the process of trying to purchase Skyline. We had designed it to go around Acorn because the Acorn property, we didn't feel that we needed waters to connect to First Street through Acorn Because there's railroad tracks there, and there's a stop sign needed to be there. And we needed waters to connect to First Street closer to the Arkansas River so that you would have staging for cars at that stop sign. So although we thought it was a good idea for Acorn not to be there, we didn't see it as a showstopper to get waters over there. To the other point, Ashley, I thank you for quoting me the regs. I absolutely don't understand the regulations of what the park is. And I completely agree with you. I would hope that the city would maintain that same concept when we're talking about, for instance, a few years ago when the owner of Shadow Hills was sitting here begging for a cost savings on water. And you talk about an amenity to a community. We lost an amenity to a community that day because the current council didn't step up. And now we're talking about stepping up to save a park, which I'm all in favor of. But I'd like to see that same attitude go to all the different amenities that this city can help draw people in, besides just
Shadow
open
Hills
space.
did get water cost savings, and we gave water cost savings to 4 Mile.
No, I understand, but at the time, 4 or 5 years ago, when it happened, this city council, not this current, but the city council took a different attitude towards it when it was Shadow Hills, and so this community lost that amenity, is what I'm saying. So I think it's important to look at it the way you're looking at it, saying, hey, let's save what we can save for the different amenities that draw people to this area. To that point, though, all I'm saying is let's put it out on the table. Let's explore all the different options that we can do with that park that is a better, completely more of an amenity to the public and to the community versus the way it's laid out today. But on that, I have been in conversations with the owner of the tourist train, and the other reason I would hate to see this delayed is, that operation is a very, very key part to the success of Canyon City, and he's in dire need of parking. And the conversation I had with him was he really needs parking really bad, and for us to try to sort of mothball this conversation while we're working with the railroad, I think would be a mistake in the train's interest as well. So.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Meisner?
I think, no?
You go ahead.
You go.
Well, I haven't said much because I've been listening to everyone. I agree with Dina that I think some of these processes can run parallel. I don't think we should wait till we have the easement worked out before we continue to plan for what we want to do with this piece that we've bought, where Skyline Steel is. I guess I don't have the same concern about the area not being visible from Highway 50. When we look at what we want that area to be, I think it will end up being an advantage that you can't see the highway from there, because what you want is the riverfront experience. But I think the wayfinding and signage that we're planning will help direct people to that area, hopefully. I mean, that should be in part of our plan, I think. I am not against the idea of trying to find some more parking in Veterans Park, but what I think is how will people get from there to across the tracks? Because right now, even when you're up in that area, kind of near our entrance to the park to our parking lot, it's difficult for people on foot to get there. There's not a sidewalk there, and there's fencing and signage that warns people not to trespass over the train tracks. So that might be another conversation we need to have with the railroad, is how can they help us accommodate connecting Veterans Park with the riverfront. And I don't know what the possibilities are for that.
Yes, the Centennial Park plan does have some concepts, but
Yeah, I think
Dina
that's,
had referred to.
Yeah, I think realistically, there probably would be a fence that would be installed on the south side of the tracks to prohibit folks from crossing.
right.
I think it's important to remember that basically, so if let's say you were parked in this location in Veterans Park, and then either walk to the west or, say, to the east to come around and get to this site, it's about a 5-minute walk.
So
Yes.
coming from Black Hills could be easier and faster, you think?
Right, I mean, or coming from the Black Hills site, I mean, that's why it's, in my opinion, critical to have a sidewalk along the future Water Street, so that if the Black Hills site is a future parking reservoir, we're able to get folks moving on foot from that parking reservoir over towards the riverfront and across to, say, the train site.
I'd like to see us explore, too, the idea of having bicycle access to this area to take folks off of Highway 50, because right now there really isn't a great way for folks on bike to get down to the riverfront,
Right, yep.
from that side of the river anyway. Those are my thoughts.
Okay. Jim, it's back to you.
Back to me. Just a kind of technical correction, I'm digressing, but I sat through the council meetings when the Shadow Hills issue was presented to council. The issue there was the city willing to take on that significant annual expense that would be required to keep the golf course open, considering the expenses of the golf course versus the income of the memberships, and it was significant. And that was the deciding factor. It wasn't water, it wasn't anything else. It was merely a monetary decision relative to the income and expenses. The other issue is, and I think John mentioned it, I think if you were to park where you had mentioned, Dina, it's really difficult to realize that there's even anything that exists south of that. I mean, that's been my experience. I've been over there with a number of events, and it's really difficult to realize, well, I mean, like, where is the ice house when you're sitting over there, because you can't see it. I mean, with those trees that were probably put there for a specific purpose, you really can't see over that direction.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, Councilman Hamrick.
And I just wanted to check, do we have, one of the things that John Paul told us was that make sure that when we do river improvements, that we look to see if there's something we can do to shrink the floodway lines. And do we have anything coming up that we can look at there?
Well, that's kind of circling back to the beginning of the conversation, and I'll reference the Skyline Steel site again. That's why it's really, really important to do design work on the Riverwalk now, because in essence, that would be sort of scooping out some of the dirt that's potentially in this area. So that would help pull back that floodway line.
Councilmember Turner.
I was just going to say to Councilman Meisner's point about the trees there on the south side of Veterans Park, I get your point that you can't see what's going on, but also you kind of don't want people to see that because they can't get across there anyway, because the railroad isn't going to allow folks to cross the tracks at that place. So
I don't disagree.
yeah.
Councilman Meisner.
I lost it.
Well, so far the direction, it seems overall, is that we want to move forward on design. We have a lot of suggestions of things to keep in mind and to explore as we move forward with getting better cost estimates, giving you broad license of design work with options to consider, reaching out to the railroad, considering enhanced parking, and at veterans and other things we can do for visibility and connection to downtown. Anything else that we're missing?
Question.
Any questions from staff, so we make sure that we give you the direction you need to move forward?
Well, so the first step before we would even begin any design work south of the tracks would be to put together an estimate of design costs and get that to you.
Okay. Councilman Meisner, then Councilman Hamrick.
I know what my question was. I thought I'd recall with some other conversations we've had with staff on floodplains and floodways that it's a 10-year thing before those lines get moved? Wasn't there some long-term? I mean, you just don't make a change and bam, the line changes. You need to go through a process of FEMA or somebody changing that line. That doesn't happen
Yes.
every year.
Ryan Stevens has an answer.
Yeah, so FEDC has actually been working on a project to remap the river, and that, there is some potential there that might change the floodplain and floodway. I'm trying to remember how far out that project is. I'd say a few years, but there are some possibilities there. And then, speaking with Adam, I think there are some things that we can do locally to, as has been discussed today, to potentially augment some of those lines.
Okay, Councilman Hamrick.
Yeah, just a suggestion on the railroad and right-of-way there. Probably the first step is to ask our attorneys to see where John got to based on his records.
We've had some of those conversations before. I don't know that we found anything in the past, but we can ask them to double check.
Okay.
Well, I guess keep moving forward at any rate. Any other direction that you need, Dina, in moving forward?
I don't. Ryan, anything else that you wanted based on the memo?
No, I think this is a good start, gives us some direction. We'll work on those design costs and bring them back to council.
Okay, and reiterate too, I know this is a little bit of a different subject, but I am interested in the other financing tools to use to help with
Yeah,
development.
I think we'll take a look at general government and vision committee meetings for a space where we can sit in and have a conversation about some of those tools.
Okay, awesome. So let's definitely get that scheduled. And Ryan, can I also request that we schedule a meeting to talk about our search for a new administrator with our attorneys?
Sure.
Any other final comments from City Council as we wrap up today? Meisner?
I just want to reiterate that we've got a unique opportunity here for the city to work with Mr. Airy, the trained people. We need to keep that whole process positive and everybody listen to everybody, and everybody's trying to get the same thing accomplished. And we need to all play on the same table and make something happen.
Any other comments from council? You'll need to please come to the microphone.
I'm sorry, this is my first meeting. I wasn't sure if you'd take comments from the public. But I wanted to thank you for opening up this meeting to the citizens of Canyon. And I'm very fortunate to live in the area that you're talking about developing. I live right off of First Street. I'm very proud of my neighborhood. And in all the conversation, I think it's extremely positive the direction you're headed. However, I would just like to remind you that you're talking about an old residential area in that section. I haven't heard much conversation about residents there, but as you're going into your planning, I would just encourage you to keep that residential area in mind. It's a very old area. We're seeing some good improvement in that area. Property taxes are going up. That's a good thing, I think. And as you're doing development, we expect that that area may change somewhat. But I just, again, would encourage you to, as you're planning this, that there is residential area all around where you're talking about. And the idea of a stoplight at First Street is kind of horrifying to me already. So, but I do appreciate the way the city is headed. And I would encourage more citizens for input into that area, because I'm going to be driving by there every day. And I just hope that you would keep that in mind, that you are very close to a residential and old area of Canyon City.
Thank you. Thank you for that reminder. It's good. It is definitely good to keep that in mind as part of the players.
Yes, ma'am. I'd just like to remind you, too, that there is a master plan that deals with this whole area, including the river corridor. It is available on our city website. If you haven't seen that, you probably should take some time to take a look at that, because some of those planning concepts are already in play.
And that would be under long-term plans on our city website. I'm personally really excited about the development of the river corridor. This is a huge step forward for Canyon City, and I'd really like to see us move forward. So thank you for your time and work on it very much. Jim, do you have a final
I
comment?
just want to clarify, or not clarify, but to add, as I mentioned, the critical relationship that happens maybe at the professional level with a variety of people, it's equally important that those citizens keep involved also, so that in 3 years from now, we don't have a group of people out here throwing their hands up in the air and saying, where's all this been happening? That the more people in your community that you can get involved in at least listening and participating in meetings is to everybody's benefit, so that as we progress, there are no surprises for the people that maybe aren't as in tune with everything that's going on in the government end. So you're always welcome, and you're always welcome to invite more of your neighbors.
And along with those lines, it's important to get the facts rather than hearsay. So,
And if you show up at the meetings, you're going to get some facts.
yeah.
All right. Well, I believe this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.